And we're live. Welcome along, everyone, to our weekly live stream. And I'm Dan Fowley, as always. Peter Chalmers is with me. Welcome, Peter.
Good morning and good afternoon. Good evening. Good night.
And and this week we have a special guest, Logan Moore, senior Salesforce engineer at Trineo. Welcome, Logan.
Good to be here. Thank you, Dan.
Do you want to give us a brief intro of your background in Salesforce and
Wow.
what's led to being here today?
I can try and be brief. Well, I've been doing Salesforce for 9 years, over 7 of which have been with Trineo. And interestingly, Salesforce was my first job out of university. I got a part-time job helping a foreign exchange company and sort of got to learn naturally. I found Trineo along the way, another partner in the industry there, and got the opportunity to work with them, and I've been here ever since. And just year on year, learning more and more until you get to the point where you can call yourself an architect and keep a straight face.
So that's good. I can vouch for met Logan back in 2012, I think it was. We worked out Logan, and a few weeks later started doing some work with us, and the rest is history. So it's been a good journey. And now as one of our senior developers who dons an architect hat at times as well. And I guess we should say that you've got some of the architect certifications that are on the way to being a CTA. We thought we'd ask you a few questions today regarding the role of architecture in a Salesforce project and ongoing maintenance of an org, and how a lot of our audience is admins, and so getting into how those roles can interact really well, and how things like technical debt can be managed appropriately and do some things. But what are your thoughts on how, as the complexity of Salesforce has grown quite immensely in the last 2 decades, how important is it to get architecture right up front?
Yeah, that's a good one. Like, a lot of my experience with customers has been dealing with architecture that has been put in place before me. And it's often, there's frustration that goes with that, because you look back and it's like, oh, it's messy, it's dirty, why is this here? Can I rip this out and not break anything? Who uses this? So architecture has sort of come to fill in this gap where, as an admin, you can go and you can make an object, you can make a field, you can make some workflow rules, and you can kind of just do what you're told, but it's taking a step back, putting yourself between the business and technical stuff, and saying, what do we really need here? What's the problem we're trying to solve, and what's the solution going to look like? And then not overcooking things as well. The worst thing you can do is just throw a whole bunch of fields at a problem and just kind of do these little pieces here and there. Don't know where I'm really going with that.
Logan, we're just getting some feedback that your mic is a bit quiet. I don't know if there's an adjustment you can make on your end.
How's that? Is that better?
That's much better.
That is better.
Brilliant.
I suppose a question I'd ask is, can you, if you build something today, is it always going to stay that way? Businesses change, and what we do changes, and how we do things inside Salesforce changes as well. And it has. I mean, in the time that we've all been around, how much have we seen what we do change, and added functionality come in for things that we would have hacked around before and done. So how we talk about technical debt, and sometimes it's seen as being a very bad thing, and there is a level of, I think, the badness in it ultimately. What's the worst thing you've ever seen? And could you fix it?
That's interesting. So technical debt sort of comes in various forms. Some of the worst technical debt I've seen is usually code related, where you hack together some code and it's sort of a prototype, and it works, and you just leave it there. And you've left this prototype code in production. And in Salesforce, we rarely get the opportunity to go back and improve things. So there's a pressure to get things right first time. And some of those things, they'll just live in your code for years, and you'll never get the chance to go and fix it. Which is sort of a testament to Salesforce, the fact that this sort of terrible code can live so long and still operate, but can just be a nightmare to deal with. On one of the projects I work on, it's very fragile and built by many developers over time with lots of varying ideas about how to do things. But it's a proverbial house of cards where there are certain things in there we do not touch, because we know if we touch it, it has a ripple effect and will break like layers and layers around it. I can't really say much about the code itself, but if you get to that point, that's bad technical debt. Yeah. So
I think I was just going to say, I think it's a challenge that exists a lot in the consulting world, because we are pay by the hour, and so the business often take a short-term view on things to getting functionality out the door. And as you say, you make the point that Salesforce as a platform actually lets these things operate for years. We're not dealing with packages and dependencies and things that are constantly needing you to go back and revisit old things. So it's sort of finding customers who understand the benefits to future development speed of doing the right things today, and versus pushing hard we can get things done to a deadline and get things out the door, but then rather than moving on to the next deadline, actually have the opportunity to clean things up and make sure things are stable for the future.
Yeah, I think the worst technical debt is something you build that never gets used.
That's
sort of you've paid money, you've put a team on this with this grand idea. You're gonna have lots of productivity, and then nobody touches the feature as well.
Yeah, that's something that's frustrating at a macro level with a big corporate, where I've seen just projects that cost a lot of money, and you actually end up doing some really good work, or some really clever code to do a thing, and then it ultimately never sees the light of day because, I don't know, a new CIO comes in the next year and says we're swapping this whole piece out for a different system, and that kind of sunk cost. And I struggle with that, because part of me in my brain says, well, we got paid for that. That's, in terms of that exchange, all things were fulfilled. But you have a sense of satisfaction from seeing something you've built be used in the wild, and when that doesn't get the chance to happen, it's frustrating.
Absolutely, yeah.
So here's a question. Okay, over the last few years, we've seen this title being thrown around of architect. I did architect there. There's solution architects, there's technical architects, there's all types of architects. What do you think it really is, and what does it really mean? I mean, what's it mean to us at Trineo?
Yeah, well, interestingly, at Trineo, we don't have anyone officially called an architect. We don't have that as a dedicated role. And I tend to shy away from, architect is an overloaded term. Like you were saying, application architect, system architect, technical architect, solution architect.
Enterprise architect.
Gosh, yes. I struggle to keep them all separate, but on a small project, if you're just a solo admin working on a project, you are the architect, whether you like it or not, because you're making the decisions that are going to affect how the solution shapes up. Once you start adding more people to a project, it's really hard to keep your head up, looking at the future, looking at the problems you're trying to solve, and make sure you're on the path to solve those problems. But also be down in the detail, engineering all the little things that make it work. Like I would say, look at the Sydney Opera House, this beautiful building. It was built for a purpose. There was a requirement. You want a landmark for events. If you just threw a whole bunch of engineers at that project, like an engineer understands how much weight a beam can hold and like how to make a building exist in real life. But it took an architect to come up with that vision for that just beautiful shape, that beautiful building. And if you just had engineers on the problem and no architect guiding the problems they're solving, I can't imagine what that would look like. It would be interesting, but it would be a hodgepodge of all sorts of ideas. So as the architect, you're there to step back, look at the system as a whole and say, based on my experience, this is what I think things are going to look like. And this is where I think we should be going. But also to step away and sort of let the engineers really do the work. So
the architect's the thinking person, the engineers are the doing. I like that idea.
Yeah. But then, an architect, it pays to be able to do, because it pays to understand, I want a roof, but I want it to float in midair and just be like it's floating. And then your engineers are going to come along, this is stupid. We can't create anti-gravity. It's a cooperation between you and the team to figure out how are we going to do this. Your team will thank you because they can solve this thing and not worry about the big details. And you'll thank the team because they can come to you and say, hey, what you're planning here may or may not work. How about we try something else? And it's a feedback loop between you and the team.
Yeah, and I think that was something I had a discussion with another one of our team the other day around. You actually need to keep getting your hands dirty to stay current.
Yep.
And that actually helps you then. It's like a circle. You can full circle and you can architect things correctly based on a platform that is adding new features 3 times a year. Thinking back to our conversation last week about the new features coming in summer, being aware of the Lightning messaging service plays a critical role in how you might choose to architect the solution. And getting your hands dirty to know how to implement it, what it's capable of, and the like. So, as you say, we don't give anyone currently the explicit title, but there's an expectation certainly within senior developers that they do both thinking and doing.
Yeah, and in that regard, you can think of everyone as an architect of varying skill. You all play a bit of an architect role. And then it's usually special circumstances that would demand an architect to step forward and take on that special role.
Yeah. And I think where traditional architecture has come from in the big corporate environments and where the enterprise architect fits in is where you've got many systems involved, complex integration, and actually taking that helicopter view and looking from 10,000 feet across the landscape to know, okay, we're building this over here in this system, but here are this is the wider ecosystem of how that has to fit in, so that as a business we have end-to-end processes that work, and that's a key role, I guess, for that level of architect who knows enough about each of those individual systems to understand their capabilities and whatnot and make them all work together.
Yes, you're in integration architecture, yeah.
Which is pretty crucial in big corporate environments.
Yeah, and keeping that information in your head is not easy. If you're constantly being distracted from it, it doesn't take long. Like, say you work on a project for 6 months, and then you come back and you could just forget about the whole lay of the land. And it will take so much effort to load that back in your head. So having somebody who's just constantly taking care of all of that and keeping that in their head, they become your go-to for like, I want to build this thing. I know there's this other system. How do we make this work? and they can just come and be like, oh yeah, here's the problems you're going to have, here's what the system does, here's what it can't do, and they just become the oracle for you. So yeah.
Oracle of Salesforce. I don't believe I just said that.
Well, half of Salesforce workforce has come from Oracle, so.
Alrighty. Dan, what's our next question?
What do we got? Let me just. So, Logan, what are some specifics, if we think about, you touched on earlier, the kinds of changes that an admin makes to the system, which could be new objects, new fields, some basic workflows and the like. What are some of the specifics that an admin should think about when implementing those kinds of things, to avoid going down the wrong path, creating technical debt, and ensuring future system success?
Yeah, at that level, technical debt isn't so risky. Once you get into coding and you have a lot of code, technical debt becomes a real problem. But if you're managing to stay with standard features, just making objects and making fields, you're pretty comfortable. The more you can do that, the better off you are. And I think it comes down to planning. I think that's something we'll talk about soon, but knowing what you're building and being deliberate, not coming with a shotgun approach of, oh, I'll make a field for this, I'll make an object for that, and I'll just, drop a whole bunch of stuff, objects, fields. Because first, your users are the ones who are actually going to use this. And if you're just throwing stuff at them, they're not going to take the time to learn, okay, what is this field? What do I need to put in here? What value do I get out of it? And therefore, they're not going to populate good data in there. And Salesforce is all about good, actionable data. So I think it pays to be deliberate, hold back a bit, and make things with very specific intent that users are willing to get on board with and say, hey, the data I put here is valuable, I will populate this field. But then your managers are also going to get that as well. If the users are willingly populating those fields, they will actually get good data. So if you have a ream of an object with hundreds of fields that nobody ever populates, it's worthless. And then in years' time, you'll ask the questions, well, why is this here? Can I delete it? I want to simplify my org. So having empathy towards users and towards your future self and teammates who are going to have to deal with things. So there are some easy things to do, like not using abbreviations, because how many times have you gone into an org and seen field TKY and field ALB and field, TIP, and had absolutely no idea what those fields are, what data they hold. And that's a technical debt, because it slows you down when you're making these changes. And anybody new who comes in, whether it be a partner or a user, they have to be trained up in all the specifics of your data architecture. I think less is more is what I'm trying to get at. And then in the future, if there's less there, there's less to get your head around, and then it's easier to be agile and make changes because you're not dealing with just loads and loads of stuff.
Yeah, I think one thing I've seen is being a good data modeler is a really good skill. If you are in that, creating objects and fields and the like, sure we've all seen instances of a pick list that should be a child object, or just understanding how junction objects work, and actually breaking things out into that normalized data form is definitely a skill, because once you start populating with data into those records, then actually reversing it out, and then you're doing migrations, and it's just, if you have to re-architect that later is a bit of a pain. So getting your data model right, if you get that right, everything else can kind of be improved and retrofitted correctly if there's something not right. But data model's key, I think.
And I'll throw out, interesting you say about normalization. To an admin who's been introduced to Salesforce and doesn't know what that is, It's about sort of breaking your data down. Say, for instance, you have an account and an account might have multiple addresses associated with it. Instead of just having address fields on the account, you could have an address object and have many address records related to one account. And actually, in my experience with Salesforce, I found it pays not to over normalize too soon. It's very easy to come in and say, oh, in this modern day and age, people have multiple cell phones, they have multiple phone numbers, so let's normalize that out. But I found there's not really much value to be had from that, and it might just have two fields, a primary phone, and if you have to, a secondary phone. The reason I say that is because the reporting tools in Salesforce are so much more powerful if you can do that. You can do all the grouping and organization, but it can get really tricky when you over-normalize the database to build meaningful reports. And it becomes trickier to maintain and understand that data model. So I'd say in the early days, avoid normalization and do it when there is an actual proved need for it, rather than just kind of normalizing because that's what database admins do.
Yeah, I think that's reporting's a really good point there, because ultimately that's what a lot of what we're building is to actually get some data out the other end in some kind of sensible form. I've definitely seen that extreme of not normalizing something that should be, which you end up with fields 1 through 20 on a page layout, which are basically the same thing. And doesn't scale. So there's definitely a balancing act in there of getting it right. But I think you make a good point of, if suddenly you've got 2 fields for something, that's probably okay. And it's deciding what's your threshold. Okay, well now we need 4. Maybe now's the time to normalize it out.
Yeah. I think there's a whole tiers of normalization. I think a typical database admin of like an Oracle or Postgres or something, they might get to the point they say, well, an address is an address, so we're going to make an object called address, and then everything relates to that. I think that's going way too far for Salesforce. So, don't get obsessed with the normalization. Yeah.
I think the good place to start is always how's it going to be used? Where's it going to be used? And that sort of starts to drive you down that. So, it's how am I going to report on this, especially from Salesforce. That can be a key to what objects do I need and where. I remember seeing an opportunity with 5 invoice fields set up: invoice 1, invoice 2, invoice 3, invoice 4, and invoice 5. Because you only ever have 5 invoices on an opportunity. The fact you've got 5, I'm still trying to get my head around. It was just a weird set, and it was one of those things like, hang on, did you really think about that? Did you really think that's ever what it's going to be?
I think that's that first aha moment as an admin, isn't it?
Yep.
Like you learn how to make a field and it's like, yes, go to town, add a whole bunch of fields. And then you have that aha field of, well, hang on, an invoice is a separate concept and it might just link to, and there are many invoices per opportunity. That's definitely an aha moment right there. And once you've got that, the world's your oyster.
And interesting enough, that was really early on in my journey on this side of the fence. It was sort of like, and it was literally, I don't think you got that right. So,
and that's one of those technical debt things that might be really hard to pay down.
Yeah.
Imagine going back and breaking that invoice out into a separate object and having to do all that, write the scripts to maintain it and stuff.
But I think the good thing at the same time is that because of the platform, because of the Salesforce platform, we can do that. So it's, you can sort of build yourself into a corner to a certain degree, but you can always do stuff. It's the effort that's involved to do that. But I haven't seen anything that couldn't be unwound, really. So.
Yep, and that's a big plus. I've heard of old school systems in the past where just getting a field change or reversing a change could take days to kind of migrate through environments because you were actually changing database tables under the hood directly. You're not, we've got kind of this really nice abstraction in the way Salesforce does the data models that gives us a lot of agility, really.
I think the theme really should have been for today's think like an architect, because that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's true.
So, whilst we're thinking like an architect, Logan, you're a certified data architecture and management designer. Is that correct?
Yes.
Some interesting words there.
I agree.
What were the topics that of those exams, and what's the best practices that you'd provide as advice to anybody that's thinking about going down that path?
Yeah, I see that as like that's your bread and butter designer certificate. It's not an architect certificate, but it's on the path to the application architect. And it's your bread and butter Salesforce. Making objects, making fields, how to think about your data and model your data. And then it leads into some more complicated topics like how to deal with large data volumes. I have had a project I worked on where it was just millions and millions and millions of records, all in like one object. And after I did this exam, I'm looking back thinking, I would have done that project so much differently. But interestingly, I actually can't recall much from the exam itself.
It's all a blur.
Well, I think to that point, I'd say, the exams are more to sort of give you confidence that you can figure things out. So, the exams won't teach you. You'll teach yourself. You'll go do trail mixes. You'll learn all the information to do the exam. But you don't come out of the exam all of a sudden enlightened as to what best practices are. But you will come out with the confidence that you can go to a customer and say, I see we're having a problem here, and I know how to figure out how to deal with it, and make that better. But yeah, I mean, keeping things lean. It mentions quite a bit about that, about planning your architecture, and it does get into sort of governance. Once you start getting into big enterprise, there's a whole new layer on top of your architecture. You can't just come in as the solo admin and solve it, make an object, make a field. You've got integrations to deal with. You've got other projects, other teams, other developers. You might have multiple partners like Trineo working on the project. And they're all trying to do things at the same time. So you get into a governance area where you have to kind of babysit all this and make sure when all this stuff comes together, it still makes a seamless product that makes sense. I can't remember any specifics about that, but it did open my eyes to lots of problems that you can solve with Salesforce, and that there are solutions out there. So,
Logan, what would you mention that scenario of millions and millions of rows in a single object? And I had a conversation with a globally senior architect at Salesforce last year who encountered the same thing, and it was kind of like, just because the system can doesn't mean you should. So and looking at archiving strategies and but you mentioned that you would potentially do that different again.
Totally differently.
What was your thinking, and how would it save millions of rows in one object?
So going back, we didn't have big objects back then. I think the first thing I would do is use big objects for that type of stuff. That really transactional stuff, big objects is perfect for that. So you're thinking delivery updates or something like that. If you're shipping products and you're getting a feed of delivery updates, that's just records upon records. No one technically owns those records. There doesn't need to be relationships. It's just transactional data. Big objects is something that I'm interested in, but still haven't really found use cases to apply it. It does have some problems. Other things is there are some SKUs that I wasn't aware of. One of them is ownership SKU, where if you've got a lot of records all owned by one person, it really hurts performance, and I can't recall the specifics. Salesforce is a bit of a black box in some of these areas, and we just sort of take it for granted. If there's a lot of records owned by one person, there's performance issues. And something else is relationship skew, where if you have one parent object, say one account, and hundreds of thousands of things related to it, that also is a sort of low performance scenario. So big objects would have been the first thing I would have attempted. Something else is actually having a sound archiving strategy. Archiving and sort of deleting data from your system is something we talk about at the bottom of the cliff. We get to our data limit, and all of a sudden it's like, we've got 10 gigs of data in Salesforce, like, we're paying through the roof for this, what do we do? And I think it pays to talk about archiving early on. Salesforce is a tool that helps running your business, and I don't think having years and years of data is necessarily helping. If you can prove it's helping, then keep it, by all means, pay for it. But having a strategy to say, look, after a year, this opportunity, it's been and gone. We'll keep some trace of it maybe, but let's get it off the platform. Let's support now rather than then. And it's easier to talk about that up front, I think, than at the bottom of the cliff.
It's interesting. Archiving is a conversation that's coming up quite regularly at the moment, and which I'm interested that it is now. There just seems to be a lot of conversations around archiving inside Salesforce, and also data recovery at the same time. Those two things can go hand in hand to a certain degree.
Yeah, data recovery is a hard topic. There was a time, I think Salesforce have turned their backs on this now, but you used to be able to pay for recovery from their tapes. And it used to cost a lot of money. But I remember they were like, we'll just hand you the CSV files and then good luck. It's over to you. And then you would have to figure out, how do I get this stuff back into Salesforce? Yeah. And it's one thing to be backing up all this data, but just how do you get it back in? You don't want to be stuck with lost data and then twiddling your thumbs trying to think, what do I do? And there are things you can do ahead of time to make that easier. And one of those is having a good external ID system. If you're lucky, you have integrations to other systems and they're providing you external IDs. And it's really easy to restore all your data using the external IDs as the reference to glue things back together. But IDs you can't mess with. Once Salesforce has generated an ID, that's it. You can't use that ID again. So it's not good for gluing things back together. But a strategy I like to do is to have an external ID and literally clone the Salesforce ID into that field. Because then I can delete that record and I can bring it back with the old ID in the external field, and it will just kind of have its new ID. But if I do all the relationships on the external field, I can literally dump the entire database and pull everything back really easily. And that even helps with the tools that purport to do all this for you. If you have external IDs ahead of time, it's much easier to get all this data back in for them as well.
Yeah, and that's a good segue to a topic we're going to talk about on a future episode with a quite promising backup and recovery tool that Peter and I have been looking at recently. That the one thing I was most impressed about was the recovery aspect, because like you've said, Logan, that's actually the tricky bit. You can have your monthly backups enabled and get a zip file of all these CSVs.
Yeah,
that's easy. Restoring's the hard bit. How do
you even practice that, right?
And that's the thing, right? Lots of people think that they're covered because they've got that, that backup there somewhere, but they never actually rehearse, what it looks like when they do have to do a recovery. Just the disaster management 101. Actually, how do we recover and stand things back up again? So yeah, we'll cover that in a future episode. Which is, it's good to see some promising tools in that space, definitely. Maybe a final question for the day. Thinking about release management, Logan, interested in your thoughts around. There's a lot of temptation, particularly for new admins, to make changes directly in production. That's a Salesforce trap, I guess. So how do you, I guess two parts, how do you set yourself up to have your sandboxes structured correctly and a good simple process for pushing these small changes through? Because suddenly the 5 minutes it takes to create a new field suddenly becomes an hour when you've got to migrate it through many environments. And secondly, any tips for admins for adopting an SFDX like process?
Yeah. This is my bread and butter. Of all the architecture stuff, the deployment lifecycle has definitely been where my focus is. I'd start off by saying there is a golden rule, which is don't do it in prod. If you can avoid it in prod, don't do it in prod. And then I'm also going to bare my soul and admit, when I started Salesforce development, as a university student doing a part-time job, I will admit, and I'm ashamed of this, so don't judge me too hard. I connected my then Eclipse IDE directly to production, and for about 6 months, I was just there, just editing code, making changes directly in prod. I look back, I can't even believe I managed to pull that off. I just shudder the thought. But so I've been at that end of the spectrum, and I know how easy it is as a solo person on a project to just do everything in production. But you're right, it's by going by the golden rule, production is never broken. There were times when I would do something on a Friday night. I'd be there after work, I'd make some change, I was happy, I'd go home for the weekend, and everyone would come back to work on Monday, and something wouldn't be working quite right. And then I would have to desperately get in production, trying to fix it on the fly as people are trying to do their job. And that's not a great situation. So I pretty quickly learned sandboxes and how to do all my changes in a sandbox. That's sort of your first step is just, if you can, do your changes in a sandbox and then test them thoroughly before moving them to production. The application lifecycle management, you can introduce it pretty slowly. Like, as a solo admin or a small team, change sets work. You don't need to buy into all the SFDX and source control. As a technical person myself, I jump straight to, let's get Git, let's get source control, let's get to continuous integration. But it's complicated, and you will invest time and money in making that, setting it up, and supporting it. If you're a small team, a change set does the job. You can just track the changes that you're making in your sandbox, and then open up a change set somewhere else. Once your team starts to grow, a few people working on one project, or perhaps even a couple of projects going at the same time, that change set dream quickly falls apart. The way when you make a change and you deploy it through, it just overwrites whatever else is there. You quickly start to get tension between teams of, well, I want to make this change to the file, but I want to make this, and then it goes slow because you're spending so much manual time managing just people and keeping things in your head. Then naturally, that's when source control enters. And for an admin, I think it can be daunting. Even for a developer, when I first learned source control and Git, it was daunting. And I will willingly admit that. And I didn't really understand it, but I learned enough to just get going. I don't think I really understood it until somebody else had set up a project and I got to come in and just work their way of doing things, that it started to click in my head and it started to make sense. So if you have the luxury, get somebody who knows what they're doing to come in and help you set it up and get it going, and then you'll start to learn, things will fall into place, and then you adopt it. And I think one of our big customers, that's pretty much happened. We've gone in, set up their source control, and now they love it. They've taken ownership of it. They're the ones driving it forward now, and that's really cool. Yeah. But in the early days, don't worry about it too much. But there will definitely be a time when it just makes sense.
Yeah. So golden rule number 1 is at least use sandboxes
Yeah.
as your starting point.
Yeah. And I don't think the source control in the CI isn't the goal either. If you look at the application lifecycle, it starts with planning, actually. It's not just the source control. It's about how do you plan the work that you're about to do, build it, test it, then how do you build a release from all the work that's been done, how do you test that release, and then how do you actually release that into production. And you can take those steps and apply it to change sets. Like you can make a plan, you can develop something in your sandbox, you can test it locally, you can have another sandbox to stage your release, and it'll work. But those sort of 6 points there are the same no matter what solution you come up with. Plan first, build, test, build a release, test your release, and then release to prod. Yeah.
Cool. That's probably a good point for us to wrap it up for today. So thank you very much, Logan, for being our guest. And just we'll finish off as always just with a bit of info about our new offering, SFDC Academy. This is where we can impart a lot of the knowledge that we've talked about on episodes like today and help admins improve their best practices in the ways that they're running an org, particularly when they are in that solo admin scenario and not using a partner all the time. So the web address is on screen now for anyone who wants to go check that out. And I think the idea is that we help you get unstuck so that you can get to your destination yourself without having to always call in an expensive partner to get the job done. And with that, we'll bid everyone farewell and be back again same time, same place next week.
See you all.
Thanks, guys.
Cool. See ya.